Any who have followed this series for some time will have probably noticed that we don't tend to cover stuff like hatchbacks that often. We will occasionally, but not usually. Most of the cars that we talk about tend to be race cars or supercars because that tends to be where the majority of oddball research is done. You'll occasionally get something like a minivan, like an Espace F1 or a Citroën Picasso Cup, for instance, but hatchbacks, not so much. When you do get a crazy hatchback though, be it concept or custom, they do tend to be pretty cool. Now, these two cars are both going to be featured in the same episode for fairly obvious reasons. They are two cars which, if you didn't know any better, you could probably assume were just the same vehicle, essentially, and of course underneath, they are, both based on the first generation notorious Mercedes A-Class. Now, the first generation, for those who are unfamiliar with it, maybe for instance younger petrol heads, you probably won't remember the controversy around this car, but it failed a major test, the elk test, an emergency swerve where the car would basically just flip over because of its high centre of gravity. Surprisingly bad from a Mercedes, given the kind of development that they're known for putting into their cars, so that was unfortunate, and it took a while to get over that image. Even the B-Class wasn't exactly a well-advised idea, given how similar it was. Now, with the second generation, you had the A200 Turbo, which was an almost 200 horsepower hatchback, which could actually hit 60 in 5.5 seconds. That's really good, but most people don't know that it's that quick. With this first generation, there was no such production performance car. The top of the tree was about 125 horsepower, because it's just not that kind of car. However, thankfully, that didn't stop the nutbags at AMG from trying to make it into one, and they made two different crazy versions, which you could understandably assume, if you didn't know any better, were potentially the same car, maybe with a different body kit, but actually these two cars are very, very different to each other. Now, the first car that we'll look at is the one that came out first, and that is the A38, and the other car is the A32. Now, you'd probably assume that the A32 would have the smaller engine, less powerful, as the name would suggest, and surely they'd make that one first. But actually no, it's the exact opposite in every way. It's more powerful, and it came out after. Now, this one first, the A38, is the madder of the two. It's not the most powerful of the two, but it's definitely crazier, because what Mercedes did is they allowed AMG to build a twin-engine version. Now, they didn't build it with two motorbike engines or two SLK engines or anything crazy like that. What they did actually sounds fairly simple. They got two of the engines that would usually be in the front of a regular A-Class, that 125 horsepower unit, but they put one in the back as well, like a smart car. Now, it actually still has a trunk. The only sacrifice that's made is, of course, weight, but the main thing is that there's now no spare tyre. But the result is, you've got a car which is front-wheel drive, front engine, but then with the flip of a switch, which, strangely enough, is the electric window switch, which in this car was repurposed, you can actually engage the rear engine as well. And the result is, of course, a 250 horsepower car with 265 pound-feet of torque, and a very unique approach to all-wheel drive. Now, it can hit 60 in 5.7 seconds and tops out at about 143 miles per hour, which might not sound as quick as you might assume from a twin-engine car, but you've got to bear in mind, of course, they're not extreme performance engines. There's just two of them, so that's actually not bad at all. Now, the car was claimed, or at least rumoured, to have been built in more than one form. Some people even say 4 of them were built, and regardless of how many were built, be it 1 all the way up to 4, at least one of them was given to Mika Hakkinen, of course an F1 driver for Mercedes at the time, and he thought highly of the car. He found it to be a well-put-together machine. Now, the suspension is lower. It actually had the brakes from the E55 AMG, so it had a lot of thought put into it to make it a much better car. But for fairly obvious reasons, it didn't reach production. Now, that's the crazy one. But it gets even better in terms of the simplicity of the design and the performance that it could have with the next one, the A32. Because despite looking very similar, but perhaps a little bit more restrained, the A32, instead of having a twin engine, has the 3.2 litre V6 engine, which is front-mounted on this occasion, like a regular car, but rear-wheel drive, And this particular choice of engine is actually taken from the A32 AMG, and it was developed, not just the engine but the car itself on this occasion, as a collaboration between AMG, who of course you'll have heard of, but also a company or a team that you might not have heard of called HWA. But if you haven't heard of them, they mean business, because they helped Mercedes develop both the CLK DTM touring car, which of course any Gran Turismo player will be well versed in, and the CLK GTR for GT1 racing. So they mean business when it comes to performance, and they helped to develop this car. Now, as I said, it's front engine instead of twin engine, it's rear-wheel drive, and it is more powerful because that V6 engine is turbocharged. It puts out 330 pound-feet of torque, 370 horsepower, but unfortunately it is a very heavy car. In fact, it weighs a similar amount to an SLR McLaren, which is very unfortunate for a tiny hatchback. It weighs a massive 1,665 kilos, because although it's a very high-performance car, it's not exactly a supercar level vehicle in terms of construction. It's not a fully carbon fiber monster, it's not stripped out, in fact it still has the same amount of seats, it's got AMG steering wheel, 5-point harnesses inside, it's well equipped, so it's basically a fully functional regular street car, but with much better performance. Now, speaking of that performance, the top speed is unfortunately, but not too surprisingly, speed limited to 155, as most German cars are, which is a bit weird, especially when it's a concept. But a better gauge of how it compares to the other one is the acceleration, because the A38 could hit 60 in 5.7 seconds, this one, despite being a much, much heavier car, can hit it in 5 seconds dead. That's pretty good, in fact, for a car especially that doesn't have the advantage of all-wheel drive, and both of these cars came out in the early 2000s, so again you have to bear in mind 370 horsepower, 0 to 60 in 5 seconds from a rear-wheel drive hatch. That actually compares really well to something like the A45 AMG, even from today, well over a decade on, in fact almost 2 decades on. So in their own weird kind of way, these are actually two pretty cool variants of what is essentially the biggest joke of the Mercedes lineup. The A-Class is notorious, for good reason. It's not a particularly good car. It did sell, understandably, but it's a car that's often used as the butt of a joke, but on this occasion, these cars are no joke, be it a crazy twin-engine version, or be it a big-capacity V6, or at least big capacity for this car. They're both very interesting takes on what could have been, were there an AMG version of this initial car. For obvious reasons, there never was, but they're definitely unsung heroes, they're oddball, they tick all of the boxes of this series, and I think they're actually pretty cool. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, if you want to check out other wacky cars in this series, of which there are plenty, then you can click through here at the end to see those. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.